Thank you, Hakim. Good evening. I think Hakim did a better job than I can of explaining it, but good evening, salam alaikum. I'd like to share with you some of my experience of working with water. And it's amazing to be here with you all in this astonishing structure. But I'd just like to show you a couple of my favorite structures and wonder if anybody here recognizes what they are. Amazing economy of strength, and this building was built with a budget of 0. It was free. Let me give you a few more examples. Does anybody have a clue what we're looking at? I think that makes it clearer. This is, oh, help. Seashells are the most amazing structures that we cannot even think to emulate. And they're built at ambient temperature in the sea, out of the materials that are in the sea, and we don't know how they do it. So water. Water plays a central part, of course, in all our lives and in our civilizations. And there's lots of water on the planet. 2/3 of the surface of the globe is water, albeit salty. And we have lots of rivers. And interestingly, many civilizations started on rivers for the reason that they provide very good communication. Before we had roads, we could use rivers for transport. But actually, the main cities of the world, many of the main cities, like London on the Thames, Paris, Cairo on the Nile, Baghdad, they didn't start as cities, they started as farms. And they started as farms that were on the best farmland because it was easy land to farm. And farmers developed and grew and became villages. And the villages became towns, and towns became cities. So it's a curious fact that at this time in history, when we are short of farmland, we've taken all our best farmland with cities. One of the best examples is Venice, of course, which interestingly owes its wealth to the control of the salt trade in the Mediterranean. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Istanbul, or Constantinople as it was then, notice that it's surrounded by water, but it's also surrounded by walls, because fortification is a major part of survival in those ages. Saudi Arabia doesn't have rivers, or at least it didn't in 1850 when this map was drawn. But it does have towns all the way down the Red Sea, which is effectively its river and its method of communication with the outside world. But it had rivers once, a few thousand years ago, and if it had rivers once, what was the conditions? What were the conditions like then? Could they be replicated? Could they be repeated? Why is it now that it's a desert when once upon a time it was heavily vegetated? And indeed, if it didn't support life and photosynthesis, there would be no oil or gas. This is Jeddah on the Red Sea. And notice again the fortifications, because it's also protecting itself as well as protecting its inhabitants, which is probably just as well. This is 500 years ago. There's a Portuguese fleet sailing up the Red Sea to attack Jeddah. I'm not sure who won, but I think it was saved. Another aspect of water is that it provides us with comfort. And this is close to the seashell. This is my favorite example of the simplest, most economic, most elegant method of providing shelter for humans. The goat hair felt covered Bedouin tent has an amazing property of absorbing water. It can hold more than twice its own weight in water. And when it gets wet, the fabric swells up and becomes waterproof, so the water sheds off. When it's dry, it becomes open. Light comes through and it provides ventilation. So it provides protection from the wind, from the sun, and from the heat, with the minimum material involved. Very simple, a house made out of grass, a house literally grown on water. And closer to home, using palms for building An addition to that is to be able to provide additional ventilation, and you're all familiar with the wind towers for catching natural ventilation and using that to cool buildings. Here's a lovely example from Hassan Fathi, the Egyptian architect, where you can see the wind comes in and it passes through a wet surface with a bottle there dripping water onto myriad surfaces. So as the air travels across, it's cooled and humidified and providing ventilation and cooling for the building for free. A lovely example of that is the Moorish palace in Spain, in the Alhambra, where the air conditioning for the building is provided by the garden outside. We have fountains providing cooling, plants transpiring water, and the rooms of the building look into the courtyard to provide a pleasant, clean, cool environment. Now, all of those concepts that I just described, we've incorporated in the Seawater Greenhouse process, which is a method of using seawater to provide cooling, using the wind to drive the evaporation process, and enable crops to be grown inside. You can see we have this sort of wind catcher design, and the wall of the building is made literally out of a cardboard material, this evaporator. We simply trickle seawater down the evaporator so that when the wind blows through it, it cools, humidifies, cleans, takes out the dust, and enables crops such as tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, French beans to grow in a climate where otherwise it wouldn't be possible because it's too hot and too arid. But the most interesting thing about this discovery that if you compare the two illustrations, the outside and the inside, we reduce the rate of transpiration maybe tenfold inside the greenhouse compared with outside, which means we need a tenth of the water to irrigate the crop and achieve a better crop. So, curiously, you can conclude from that that water vapor is more valuable than fresh water if you want to cultivate crops in a hot, arid region. Now, Saudi Arabia is short of fresh water, but it's not short of seawater. And indeed, I think most of the fresh water here comes from desalination plants. And it's a part of the process that with desalination, for every liter of you create another brine, which goes back into the sea. And I'd like to suggest that that brine is a valuable resource that could be used to good effect for cooling and for enabling crops to grow, suppressing dust and eventually producing salt, whereas rejecting it into the sea causes a major problem because as the salinity of the Gulf and the Red Sea increases, gradually marine life is killed off. The Gulf is now something like 20% more salty than the open ocean, and when that salinity reaches between 50 and 100%, all fish, all marine life die because salt is poisonous in those concentrations. So it's a problem looking for a solution, and the solution is simply to evaporate it and see the value chain of the salt. This evaporator is, you can see there's a piece of cardboard, and there's a magical effect that happens when we trickle seawater over it, because the calcium, rather like the shell, the seashell I showed you, the calcium in seawater precipitates out on the cardboard and reinforces it and gradually turns it into like a seashell, into like a coral reef. This evaporator I'm showing you here is 7 years old. It's had seawater being trickled over it for 7 years, and it's gradually got stronger and stronger by building up the calcium. The most important formula on the planet is deceptively simple. Carbon dioxide and water in the presence of light makes sugar, makes energy. And this is the process that is responsible for all the oil, all the gas, all the coal, all the food, all the greenery, all the trees, all the vegetation on the planet. And it's such a simple formula, but we don't actually understand it. There's nobody on this planet who knows how to produce 1 blade of grass. It's that complex. But we know enough about what's going on to be able to use it and work with it. And what you see in the picture is the stomata of a tomato leaf. And the tomato leaf has to absorb carbon dioxide in order to be able to grow, but it can only do that if the membrane is wet. So it needs to be in a cool and humid environment to be able to keep that membrane wet. If it's very hot, very windy, and very sunny, the membrane dries out, photosynthesis stops, and the stomata closes up. So we have a curious conflict that while we know that photosynthesis is driven by sunlight, and the more light equates to more growth, transpiration is a function of temperature. So the more heat there is, the less growth. So the trick we have developed with the seawater greenhouse process is take the heat out of the light to cool the light to the greenhouse and take that heat away and use it for something else, like evaporating seawater and condensing it into fresh water. This is a design for a solar-powered desalination and horticultural project in Australia, in one of the hottest parts. It's right on the edge of the outback. And this is the finished product. It's a fairly modest 2-meter greenhouse in the middle of, more or less in the middle of nowhere. It's on the edge of the outback in a place called Port Augusta. And the vegetation you see there is all sea scrub. It's plants that survive in seawater. Inside, we have fairly top-end hydroponic, computer-controlled, very sophisticated growing method. And against many people's expectations, we managed to get very high yields in this pilot project, such that our major client that we supplied, Coles, the supermarket, asked if we could expand the greenhouse to supply all of their tomatoes, because, as you may know, Australia is always suffering from one environmental catastrophe or another. It's always either on fire, or there's a drought, or there's a tornado going through the place, all of which affects agricultural production, all of which makes prices very volatile, and that's what supermarkets don't like. So we can put this thing in somewhere and not care about drought or being drought-proof because we're making our own water. So we came up with various concepts for how do you expand it, how do you get the best, how can you make it infinitely large, and how can you use it to best effect to evaporate large volumes of water, combine it with power generation from solar concentrated power. And we ended up with this. This is a 20-hectare glasshouse in Australia, producing 17,000 tons of tomatoes a year, which meets about 20% of the total demand in Australia for tomatoes from this one little footprint of a glasshouse. Yields are very high, and it's a very sophisticated operation. It's a very high capital cost, but the high capital cost works in Australia because labor costs are very high, and the client wanted to invest as much as they possibly could in order to reduce the operational costs, so that once the thing is paid for, it can make a profit for the next 20 years. At the other end of the scale, this project generated a lot of interest from all sorts of people, and much of it came from countries around the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa, as you probably know, is the world's most water insecure region, which makes it the world's most food insecure region, and the food insecurity also makes it the most insecure region. Somalia is the world's #1 failed state, not least because it can't feed itself. Eritrea is not far behind. Somaliland, Djibouti, and Ethiopia all have this particular problem. So would that seawater greenhouse we designed for Australia work in Somalia? Probably not. It's too expensive, too complex, and unnecessarily sophisticated for that kind of environment. So we collaborated with some colleagues from university, and we did lots of modeling to see how can we simplify, and yet simplify again. And we ended up with a Bedouin tent. What is the simplest structure you can have? So we the design here you see is a Bedouin tent. We've modeled it and done various simulations. And it told us that we could use the wind to drive the ventilation, like I was showing you earlier, wind-driven ventilation, which saves a huge amount of money. It's not covered in glass, it's covered in net, because we don't want to trap heat. We always want to make it cooler inside. But by using this zone of cooling, we can also create an oasis effect and enable other crops other than tomatoes and lettuce, the delicate crops such as onions and carrots and orchards and things, to be cultivated outside, benefiting from the cool, humid air. The bottom illustration is a section through the Bedouin tent. You see we have evaporators both on two sides, because the wind can blow. There is a prevailing wind there, but it sometimes blows from the north, sometimes it blows from the south, and we can choose which evaporator we turn on. The entire structure, the entire system is run off solar PV, which is in that little shed on the top there. We have a desalination system. We've got a local crew of pastoralists who built it and operate it. The solar PV on the roof of the building there drives all of the irrigation and all of our power and the cooler and the fridge and all of the other things. And this little white box here is a reverse osmosis desalination unit. And it's managed by the one chap who you can see is rather hot. And curiously enough, that's the first desalination unit in the Horn of Africa, which sounds quite extraordinary. A region that receives something like $45 billion of aid money annually, which feeds people and keeps them alive, but it doesn't solve the problem. This year we got our first crop, tomatoes and cucumbers and lettuce and all those things, and we're going the full circle. We desalinate water to get a very low recovery. We get about 20% recovery of fresh water, which we use for irrigation. The brine, we don't reject it back into the sea, we pour it over the evaporators and circulate it until it becomes saturated with brine, and then we take it away and produce salt. So we get a value chain out of all aspects of it. So here's a curious thought. We all know about climate change and carbon footprints, and as though we've just trodden in something, and CO2 is the main culprit for climate change, but in fact CO2 is also the main feedstock for plants. We could grow more plants if we had more water. Now this illustration is a what if, because by scaling the thing up, it would be perfectly possible to make the country, indeed Somaliland, indeed Somalia, self-sufficient in fresh produce at a tiny fraction of the cost of sending aid. In fact, it would, to make this country self-sufficient in fresh produce would consume just 1% of the annual aid budget to the region. So that's not an annual cost, it's a one-off forever cost. The conditions in the Horn of Africa are not so different from here in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, there are different places with different zones and different types of conditions, but the summers here are extremely fierce and hot. 45 degrees is common. And the winter, it never gets cooler than 20 degrees, so it is always hot. But we've done this simple calculation that says it would take 20 square kilometers of this type of operation to feed 4 million people. I think if we applied the same numbers to Saudi Arabia, we could just add a naught to all of those numbers, because I think you have a population of 30 million here and a bit more. But it's not a major. I mean, of course, but it's not a major project in terms of the grand scheme of things. I'd like to leave that thought with you, and thank you for listening.
Mr. Charlie Payton. Anybody? Any questions for Mr. Charlie Payton? Yes, a gentleman in the back there.
Sir.
Is the mic working? It is
Yep.
not.
Shout.
You can shout, that's fine. We're disruptors.
Okay, so thank you very much for coming. Very informative. The question is two questions actually rolled into one. The first question is about scale. Can it be done on a smaller scale? Sorry, yeah, thank you for coming. So I have two questions, but actually it's really one question. Very informative. Can this be done on a smaller scale? So can small independent farmers use this kind of technique and method? And second question related to the first is, does the economics make sense as well? Does the cost of doing so on a smaller scale make sense?
This is about the smallest scale you can do it on. I did it this afternoon in a workshop in one of the rooms upstairs. Evaporating seawater, showing how it provides cooling, and having a cold glass which produces condensation. That's not a very profitable thing for a grower to do. But the examples I've shown you are roughly, the very first one was in Tenerife, was 500 square meters. The one in Australia started at 2,000 square meters. The project in Somaliland is 1 hectare, but the greenhouse itself is just 1,000 square meters. So it's a scalable thing. There are economies of scale, obviously. Before you start, you need a well, you need pumps, you need solar PV, you need to put a fence around it. So there are costs that you can't get away from. But we designed it specifically in that location to be 1 hectare, a family-sized unit, an affordable unit for one family, where you can employ all the family, because that's how the socio-economic thing works best in that part of the world. Whereas the Australia project is, I call it the Goldman Sachs approach to cultivating tomatoes. It's ruthlessly money-driven, and it is driven with a bottom line. The whole purpose of it, there is no purpose, is to make money. But you know, they deemed that investment was necessary to make it. And in both cases, I can tell you that returns are of the order of 25%, are kind of what's expected and what's being achieved.
Yes, we have a question here.
Yes, doctor. I want to know, this example, when you brought, from where do you get it? Like, how do you form it?
Oh, China. Or it comes from all over the place. It was actually invented by a company in Sweden, and they invented it, or its main purpose is to clean the air in car paint spray shops. If you're spraying a car and there's a speck of dust, then you get a little blemish and you've got to start all over again. So car manufacturers and other people doing that kind of work go to enormous lengths to make it clean as possible. So in a paint spray shop, the air goes through that and it's washed, so any contaminant is washed out. And we found that to be a real benefit, because when this, a little bit of a sidetrack, but when the salinity goes high on the pad, all the airborne contaminants that come through the pad, diseases and vectors and pathogens and things, they get stuck on the soggy, wet, sticky, salty surface, which kills them. Then they get flushed down to the tank and it circulates around. As a consequence of that, we've pretty much always been able to grow things organically with very little problem from pest and disease. It was an unintended consequence, but a great benefit from using seawater for this process.
Yes, our unfortunately last question down here.
You, sir? Yeah?
This gentleman here, yes.
Okay, what about like soil that doesn't have nutrients or minerals? Then
Yeah, no, that's a challenge. In a sense, the easiest solution is to use hydroponics, which is what I showed you at the Australian project. You put the nutrients in the water. You pump the water around, but you need quite sophisticated control and monitoring, and it's not an easy thing to do. Oh, you buy them. I mean, they're commonly available, but it's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. But in the Somaliland project, which is much simpler, it's almost impossible to get nutrients. So we use whatever's locally available, which is, luckily, large volumes of goat manure. So we pay kids to collect the goat manure, which we then compost, mix it with soil and clay, roughly 30%, 30%, 30%. And that makes quite a good fertilizer, over time, as we build up vegetation, there's always a lot more stuff that we can use that we can then compost. And we also get the kids to go along the beach and collect seaweed, because seaweed is a fantastic fertilizer, because it's got a bit of everything. The sea has got every mineral there is, and it's the most productive, if you like, hydroponic system. It's just a bit too salty. So seaweed, fish waste, and animal waste is the preferred organic solution.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Payton, for an absolutely fascinating talk.